The air in the bistro turned to ice the moment the black waitress leaned over the Mafia Boss's father and whispered 3 words in a Sicilian dialect that hadn't been heard in Manhattan for 50 years. Silverware clattered. Handguns were half-drawn beneath the tablecloth. And for the first time in his life, Marzio Russo watched his legendary father turn pale, not because of a threat, but because a woman in a service uniform had just spoken the language of the kings. At Loretta, survival wasn't about strength, it was about being a shadow. Loretta M. Avant was a master of the middle distance, looking through people, never at them. To the world, she was just a pair of hands carrying a tray. To Loretta, that was the only way to stay alive. She had spent years perfecting the art of the ghost, masking her intellect and a heritage too dangerous to name in a city where the wrong last name could get you buried. But the night the Russo family cleared the mezzanine, the shadows weren't deep enough to hide her. Armo Padavisi, the old lion of the Sicilian underworld, moved into the room like a heavy weight settling into place. He was a relic of a dying era, surrounded by a new generation of monsters led by his son, Marzio. The staff was paralyzed, their hands shaking as they polished glasses that were already clean. Loretta was supposed to serve the Barolo and vanish. Instead, as she poured, she heard the younger men mocking the old traditions, the very codes her grandfather had died to protect. A fire buried in her blood for a decade suddenly roared to life. When she leaned in and greeted the old man in the dead dialect of the Sicilian mountains, the room didn't just go quiet. It stopped breathing. Because in that moment, the invisible waitress was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew the Russo family's darkest secrets before Marzio was even born. The crew saw a waitress. Armo Padavisi saw a ghost from the old country. And everyone realized the same terrifying truth, the true queen of the underground had been hiding in plain sight. The shift at Loretta had begun like any other, with the low hum of jazz and the rhythmic clink of silver against porcelain. But by 6 p.m., the air changed. It started with the manager, Mr. Henderson, a man whose spine was usually as stiff as his starched collar. Loretta watched from the shadows of the service station as he dropped a stack of menus, his hands trembling so violently he didn't even stop to pick them up. His face, usually a mask of professional indifference, had turned the color of curdled cream. "Clear the mezzanine," Henderson hissed, his voice cracking. "Now. Every table. I don't care if they're halfway through their entrees. Comp the meals, give them vouchers, just get them out." The staff moved with a frantic, desperate energy. Marco, the lead busboy, nearly tripped over his own feet, his eyes wide with the kind of primal fear usually reserved for a natural disaster. The shadow was falling, a darkness that didn't come from the setting sun, but from the blacked-out SUVs currently idling at the curb. Loretta stayed in the middle distance, her movements fluid and invisible, observing the chaos without being swept up in it. She knew that in a storm, the birds that fluttered most were the first to be caught. Then, the doors opened. The restaurant didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. Marzio Russo entered first, a man who wore violence like a bespoke fragrance. He was sharp edges and expensive silk, moving with a predatory grace that made the very floorboards seem to cower. Behind him walked his crew, a phalanx of thick-necked men with eyes like cold stones, their hands hovering perpetually near the vents of their jackets. But it was the man in the center who commanded the gravity of the room. Armo Padavisi, the old lion, walked slowly, leaning on a silver-headed cane that tapped against the marble floor with the steady, ominous beat of a drum. He was the history Marzio was trying to rewrite, a relic of a time when the blood on one's hands was a matter of honor, not just business. Loretta watched as Henderson approached them, bowing so low it looked like he might collapse. "Don Russo, Signor Padavisi, your table is ready. The entire floor is yours." Marzio didn't even look at him. He scanned the room with a bored, lethal curiosity, his gaze sliding right over Loretta as if she were part of the furniture. To him, she was a non-entity, a tool to be used and discarded. But as Loretta's eyes met the old lion's for a fleeting, dangerous second, she felt a shiver of recognition. She saw the weary weight of the old country in his eyes, the same weariness her grandfather had carried. The crew fanned out, their presence turning the elegant dining room into a fortress. The other waitresses had retreated to the kitchen, one of them audibly sobbing behind the swinging doors. The terror was a physical thing now, thick enough to taste. "Loretta," Henderson whispered, grabbing her arm with a grip that left a bruise. "You're the only one who isn't shaking. You take the mezzanine. Just pour the wine and keep your mouth shut. Don't look at them. Don't even breathe near them. If you mess this up, we're all dead before the check comes." Loretta smoothed her apron, her face a calm, unbreakable mask. She was a ghost, after all. And ghosts didn't fear the dark. She picked up the heavy bottle of Barolo, the glass cool against her palm, and began the long walk toward the lion's den. The mezzanine felt like an island cut off from the rest of Manhattan, a silent stage where the air was heavy with the scent of leather, expensive cologne, and a sharp, metallic edge that suggested hidden steel. As Loretta stepped onto the floor, the click of her heels seemed to echo too loudly against the tension. Armo Padovisi was already seated at the head of the long, white-clothed table. He sat with a terrifying stillness, his back unbowed by the years, his hands resting calmly atop his silver cane. There was a quiet dignity to him, a gravitas that didn't need to shout to be heard. He looked like a man who had seen empires rise and fall and had likely had a hand in both. His eyes, clouded by age but sharp with a predatory intelligence, stayed fixed on the middle distance, seemingly unimpressed by the opulence around him. The contrast with the men surrounding him was jarring. Marzio Russo sat to his father's right, his movements restless and loud. He checked his gold watch every few minutes, the diamond-encrusted bezel catching the light with an arrogant flash. His crew was worse, a collection of modern-day mercenaries who treated the upscale bistro like a conquered territory. They laughed too loudly, their voices coarse and grating, filled with the boastful slang of the streets rather than the measured cadence of the old world. One soldier leaned back so far his chair groaned, his jacket falling open to reveal the checkered grip of a high-capacity pistol. "They don't make bread like this in the city anymore," Armo said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the crew's chatter like a blade through silk. He picked up a crust of bread, his movements slow and deliberate, almost ritualistic. "It's just dough, Pop," Marzio snapped, not looking up from his phone. "Eat, so we can get to the meeting. Time is money, and we're burning both sitting here." A ripple of uneasy laughter went around the table from the soldiers, a performance of loyalty to the son that bordered on disrespect to the father. They were men of the moment, obsessed with the now, with the digital numbers on a screen and the quick brutality of the new guard. They looked at Armo as if he were a museum piece, venerated, perhaps, but ultimately irrelevant to the fast-paced violence of their world. Loretta approached with the Barolo, her breath steady, her ghost mask firmly in place. She felt the weight of their collective gaze, a mixture of predatory interest and dismissive coldness. To the soldiers, she was a set of curves in a uniform, to Marzio, she was an obstacle to his efficiency. But as she leaned in to show the label to Armo, she saw the way his fingers traced the carving on his cane, a specific, traditional pattern of the Sicilian hills. "A 2015 Reserva, Signor," Loretta murmured, her voice a low, neutral hum. Armo gave a single, curt nod, but his eyes never left the table. He seemed isolated in his own dignity, a lion surrounded by hyenas who wore his name but didn't understand his soul. The crew continued their boisterous talk, mocking a rival's misfortune and bragging about a recent liquidation in Brooklyn, their modern cruelty echoing off the mahogany walls. Loretta poured the wine, the dark red liquid swirling into the crystal glass like a secret. She noticed the way Armo's jaw tightened at a particularly crude joke from one of Marzio's lieutenants. The disconnect was total. The old world was sitting at the same table as the new, and the new had forgotten how to listen. As she pulled back, she caught a glimpse of a small, faded tattoo on Armo's hand. An ancient symbol of a village she had only ever heard of in her grandmother's hushed, rhythmic stories. The shadow of the past wasn't just in the room, it was sitting right in front of her, waiting for someone to recognize it. The transition from tension to terror happened in a heartbeat. In the service galley, the air was thick with the smell of scorched garlic and the panicked panting of the staff. Jean-Pierre, the head waiter, a man who had served presidents without breaking a sweat, stood clutching a silver carafe, his face a ghostly, translucent blue. As the loud, sharp laughter of Marzio's crew erupted from the mezzanine, echoing like a gunshot through the hall, Jean-Pierre's eyes rolled back. He collapsed into a heap of starched linen and polished shoes, the carafe clattering across the tiles. "He's out," Marco hissed, backing away as if the unconscious man were contagious. Henderson, the manager, looked at the fallen waiter and then at the swinging doors, his eyes wide and wild. He knew the protocol. The Marzio Russo table demanded a specific level of service, a veteran hand. But there was no one left who could stand upright. He turned to Loretta, his fingers digging into the fabric of her sleeve with a desperation that bordered on a plea. "You," he croaked. "You've done the wine. You're the only one who didn't flinch when they walked in. You're on them now. Full service. Appetizers, mains, the works." "I'm just a ghost here, Mr. Henderson," Loretta replied, her voice steady, an island of calm in the frantic kitchen. "You said it yourself, stay invisible. The rules changed the second they sat down." Henderson whispered, his face inches from hers. "If they have to wait, if the service isn't perfect, they won't just leave a bad review. They'll burn this place to the ground with us inside. Go. Now." Loretta adjusted her cuffs, the movement precise and deliberate. She felt the weight of the order, not just the food she was about to carry, but the command of fate that was pushing her out of the shadows. She loaded a heavy tray with plates of pulpo and carpaccio, the porcelain gleaming under the harsh kitchen fluorescence. She knew that every step toward that mezzanine was a step away from the safety of her anonymity. As she pushed through the double doors, the atmosphere hit her like a physical wall. The crew's conversation had shifted from business to a crude, degrading commentary on the women passing by on the street below. Marzio was laughing, a sharp, barking sound that lacked any real humor, while his father, Armo, sat in a silence so profound it seemed to vibrate. Loretta moved with the grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime navigating minefields. She approached the table, the tray balanced effortlessly on one hand. As she began to set the plates down, one of the soldiers, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, reached out and caught her wrist. His grip was hot and tight. "Hey, beautiful," he mocked, his voice slurred with the first glass of Barolo. "You're new. What happened to the old guy? Did he see the boss and have a heart attack?" The table went quiet. Marzio watched with an amused, cruel smirk, waiting to see how the help would react. Loretta didn't pull away. She didn't look down at the hand on her wrist. She kept her gaze fixed on the middle distance, her pulse as slow as a deep-sea tide. "The service is being handled, Senior," she said, her voice a cool, professional velvet. "Shall I pour more wine, or would you prefer to keep your hand where it is?" From the head of the table, she felt Armo's eyes snap toward her. The old lion wasn't looking at her tray, he was looking at her eyes, searching for the crack in the mask. The soldier's grip on Loretta's wrist tightened, a silent challenge issued in front of his peers. The air around the table grew thin, the kind of vacuum that precedes a lightning strike. Marzio Russo leaned back, a predator enjoying the sport, his eyes traveling from Loretta's dark, steady face to the white-knuckled hand of his lieutenant. He didn't intervene. In his world, power was a thing to be tested, and the waitress was currently the whetstone. Loretta did not flinch. She stood as still as a statue in a storm, her gaze never dropping to the man's hand, nor rising to meet the mockery in his eyes. She remained in that middle distance, a space where she was neither victim nor aggressor, but a professional force of nature. "Let her go, Sal," Marzio finally said, his voice laced with a bored, casual cruelty. "She's here to feed us, not entertain you. Besides, you're getting grease on the linen." The soldier, Sal, let out a sharp, forced laugh and released her, giving her arm a dismissive shove. "Just making sure she's got a pulse, boss. She's so quiet I thought she was a mannequin." Loretta moved instantly, her transition back into service so seamless it was as if the assault had never happened. She placed the carpaccio in front of Armo with a precision that was almost rhythmic. She could feel the heat of the younger men's suspicion. To them, her silence wasn't just professional, it was suspicious. In a room full of people who barked, a woman who didn't even whimper was a variable they couldn't calculate. "She's got ghost eyes," one of the younger guys at the far end of the table muttered, leaning over his plate. He stared at her with a raw, unblinking hostility, the kind of look meant to break a person's spirit. "You from the neighborhood, sweetheart? Or did you just drift in from the harbor?" Loretta ignored the bait, moving to the next guest to clear a stray glass. She felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical burden. They were looking for a crack, a tremble in her hands, a flicker of fear in her eyes, a stumble in her step. They wanted her to be small so they could feel large. Every time she reached across the table to set a plate or pour water, she was entering their kill zone, navigating a thicket of loaded holsters and arrogant entitlement. But it was Armo Padavisi who provided the real test. While the younger men used noise and posturing to exert dominance, the old lion used silence. He hadn't touched his food. Instead, he watched Loretta's hands. He watched the way she held the tray, the way she respected the hierarchy of the table by serving the eldest first, and the way she never once looked at the guns that were now casually displayed on the white cloth. "The girl has been trained," Armo said suddenly, his voice a low vibration that silenced the bickering soldiers. He wasn't looking at his son. He was looking at the way Loretta folded a fallen napkin. "She doesn't move like a girl from the harbor. She moves like someone who knows what it means to carry a secret." Marzio scoffed, stabbing a piece of octopus with his fork. "She's just a waitress, Pop. You're seeing ghosts because you're looking for them." Loretta's heart hammered a steady, hidden rhythm against her ribs. She was being dissected by a master. The invisibility she had spent 3 years building was being peeled away, layer by layer, under the old lion's focused stare. She stepped back into the shadows of the sideboard, her hands clasped behind her back, once again a master of the middle distance. But she knew the test wasn't over. It was just beginning. The meal progressed with a cold, mechanical efficiency, the clatter of silverware providing the only shield against the suffocating silence that Armo Padavisi had cast over the table. Loretta remained at the edge of the light, a statue in black and white, watching the interplay of two worlds that no longer spoke the same language. Marzio was deep into a loud, aggressive pitch about a new shipping terminal in New Jersey, his hands gesturing broadly as he described optimizing the supply chain, a corporate euphemism for the smuggling routes that had fueled his family's rise. His crew nodded along, their eyes lit with the hungry glow of men who worshipped at the altar of the dollar. They spoke of the old country as a vacation spot, a place of sun-drenched villas and cheap wine, oblivious to the soil and blood that had birthed their power. Armo, however, seemed to be drifting. He had barely touched his pulpo, the delicate meat turning cold on the plate. He stared at the condensation on his water glass, his expression one of profound, weary isolation. Loretta stepped forward to refresh his wine, her movements as silent as a falling leaf. As she leaned in, the younger men's voices rose in a boisterous laugh over a joke about a rival's demise. In that pocket of noise, Armo let out a long, shuddering breath. It wasn't a sigh, it was a mourning. "Terra amara e senza figli," he whispered, so low it was almost a hum. "Ufoku es sastatau e a casa e fritta." Bitter land and childless, the fire has gone out and the house is cold." The words hit Loretta like a physical blow. It wasn't just Italian, it was a specific, archaic dialect from the heart of the Sicilian mountains, a dialect that didn't just describe a place, but a code of existence. It was the old tongue, a language of shepherds and kings that her grandfather had used when the world felt too heavy to bear. Armo wasn't talking to his son or his soldiers, he was speaking to the ghosts of a Sicily that had been paved over by the very men sitting at his table. Loretta's hand faltered for a fraction of a second, the neck of the wine bottle hovering just an inch above the crystal rim. She looked at the top of Armo's head, at the thinning silver hair and the weathered skin of a man who realized he was the last of his kind. He was lamenting a world where honor was more than a brand and where a man's word was his life. The soldiers continued their crude banter, their laughter sharp and hollow, completely deaf to the heartbreak being whispered inches from their ears. To them, Armo was a silent statue, to Loretta, he was a man screaming into a void. She felt a surge of something she hadn't permitted herself to feel in years, a duty of blood. Her ghost persona, the shield of invisibility she had used to survive the cold streets of New York, began to crack. She wasn't just a waitress in a Manhattan bistro anymore. She was a daughter of the same bitter land, a keeper of the fire that Armo believed had gone out forever. As she pulled the bottle away, she caught Armo's reflection in a polished silver tray. He looked utterly defeated, a king presiding over a court of strangers. Loretta retreated to the shadows, but her eyes remained fixed on him. The middle distance was gone. The connection was made. The moment demanded a sacrifice. Loretta knew that by speaking, she was murdering the ghost she had spent 3 years inhabiting. She looked at Armo, whose head remained bowed under the weight of his own isolation, and then at Marzio, who was currently mocking the backwardness of the mountain villages his father still loved. The fire her grandfather had tended wasn't out, it was merely waiting for a spark. Loretta stepped forward. She didn't scurry or hesitate. She moved with a slow, ceremonial gravity that drew the eyes of every man at the table. The younger soldiers went quiet, their instincts sensing a change in the air, a shift from service to something they couldn't name. She ignored them, her focus narrowed down to the old man at the head of the table. She leaned in, her body creating a private sanctuary between her and Armo. The scent of his old-fashioned cedarwood cologne filled her senses. She didn't reach for his wine glass this time. Instead, she leaned closer to his ear, her voice a low, melodic vibration that carried the resonance of ancient stone and deep valleys. "You foca non esastitau mai, patri," she whispered. "Simu li figli di la terra chi non mori mai." The fire never went out, father. We are the children of the land that never dies. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Armo Padavisi didn't just look up, he recoiled as if he had been struck by lightning. His hands, previously still, gripped his silver-headed cane until his knuckles turned as white as the tablecloth. His eyes, once clouded, flared with a terrifying, lucid intensity. But it was the crew that reacted with the most violence. The younger men didn't know the words, but they knew the shift in Loretta's power. They didn't hear a waitress, they heard a threat in a code they weren't permitted to understand. Marzio's chair screeched against the marble floor as he surged halfway to his feet. Sal, the lieutenant with the jagged scar, reached into the vent of his jacket, his fingers wrapping around the grip of his weapon. Across the table, a soldier paused with his glass halfway to his lips, the red wine trembling in the crystal. The room became a tableau of frozen violence, a circle of predators ready to tear apart the woman who had dared to break the silence. "What did you say?" Marzio barked, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. "What did you say to him?" Loretta didn't pull back. She stood her ground, her face a calm, unbreakable mask of authority. She looked Marzio Russo directly in the eye for the first time, her ghost eyes now replaced by the iron gaze of a woman who knew exactly who she was. She wasn't looking at a boss, she was looking at a child who had forgotten his lineage. The crew remained poised on the edge of a massacre, their eyes darting between Marzio's rage and the waitress's impossible composure. The air in the mezzanine was so thick with the threat of death that the jazz music from the floor below seemed to vanish entirely. Armo Padovisi was the only one who didn't move. He stared at Loretta, his lips parted, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked as though he were seeing a miracle or a demon. "Say it again," Armo rasped, his voice no longer a rumble but a plea. "Say the last word again." The silence that followed was heavier than the violence that had preceded it. Armo Padovisi did not move for a long, agonizing minute. His eyes, usually veiled by the cynical film of a man who had seen too much, were wide and glistening under the restaurant's amber chandeliers. The silver lion on his cane seemed to shimmer as his hands trembled, a rhythmic shaking that betrayed the tectonic shift occurring inside him. Slowly, the old lion leaned back, his gaze never leaving Loretta's face. To his son and the soldiers, she was still just a waitress who had stepped out of line, but to Armo, the room had dissolved. Manhattan was gone, the bistro was gone. In their place stood the sun-scorched hills of a village that had been wiped from the maps, a place where the air tasted of wild thyme and old blood. "Non mori mai," Armo whispered, his voice cracking like dry earth. He hadn't heard that specific inflection, the way she softened the vowels just enough to denote the valley of the Sicilian, since his mother had died in a cold Brooklyn winter 40 years ago. It was a secret dialect, a language of the hearth used only by the families who guarded the old laws. It was the tongue of those who chose silence over betrayal, a code that Marzio and his men were too modern to ever learn. A single tear, thick and slow, escaped the corner of Armo's eye and traced a deep path through the wrinkles of his cheek. It was a sight so impossible that Sal's hand actually slipped from his holster in sheer confusion. Marzio stood frozen, his mouth open to deliver a killing blow of words that now felt utterly hollow. He looked at his father, then at Loretta, realizing for the first time that there was a wall between them, a wall made of history that he had no way of climbing. "Who are you?" Armo rasped, his voice raw with a sudden, desperate hope. "That greeting, that is the greeting of the custody. My grandfather used those words when he stood at the gates of the vineyard to welcome the brothers back from the hills. He reached out, his weathered hand hovering in the air between them. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability, a king reaching for a lifeline. He looked at Loretta's dark skin, at her steady eyes, and at the dignified set of her shoulders. He wasn't seeing a stranger. He was seeing the living proof that the fire hadn't been extinguished, that the diaspora had carried the embers further than he ever imagined. "My grandfather was a man of the hills, Signor," Loretta said, her voice a calm, resonant anchor in the middle of the storm. "He taught me that a house is only cold if the children forget the language of the fire. I have forgotten nothing." Armo let out a ragged sob, a sound of such pure, unadulterated relief that it made the soldiers flinch. He realized that this woman, whom they had treated like a ghost, held the keys to his own soul. She knew the names of the dead. She knew the rhythm of the land. She was the only person in a city of millions who truly understood what he was mourning. The fragile piece of the mezzanine shattered the moment Marzio Russo found his voice. He slammed his palm onto the table, the vibration rattling the fine crystal and making the soldiers jump. The awe that had momentarily paralyzed him was gone, replaced by the defensive fury of a man who realized he had been excluded from a secret. "Enough of this theater!" Marzio roared, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "What did she say to you, Pop? What kind of game is this?" He turned his predatory gaze toward Loretta, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure malice. "I don't know what kind of hustle you're running, or where you picked up those words, but you don't play with my father. Sal, get her out of here. Find out who she's working for." Sal moved instinctively, stepping forward to grab Loretta's shoulder, his face set in a mask of brutal efficiency. But before his fingers could touch the fabric of her uniform, the sound of wood striking marble stopped him dead. Armo Padavisi had slammed the base of his silver cane against the floor. The sound was as sharp as a gunshot, echoing off the high ceilings and silencing the room with the weight of ancient authority. The old lion didn't rise from his chair, he didn't need to. He simply turned his head and looked at his son. It was a look Marzio hadn't seen in 20 years, a cold, terrifying clarity that stripped away the corporate suits and the Jersey terminals, returning them both to the blood-soaked dirt of their origins. It was the look of a Don who still held the power of life and death in his silence. Marzio's bravado withered. He pulled back, his mouth snapping shut, his breath hitching in his throat. "Sit down, Marzio," Armo said, his voice no longer a rasp but a command of iron. "Pop, she's a waitress, she." I said sit. Marzio sank into his chair, his hands trembling with suppressed rage and confusion. Armo then turned his gaze toward Sal and the rest of the crew, who stood huddled like nervous wolves. "You see a waitress," Armo said, his voice carrying to every corner of the mezzanine. "You see someone to mock. Someone to touch. Someone to ignore. But you are blind. You have forgotten the blood that built the chairs you sit in. You have forgotten the tongue that gave you your names." He looked at Loretta, his expression softening into a look of profound, humbled reverence. "This woman is a daughter of the custody. She is the keeper of the fire you were too lazy to tend." Armo slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet. He stood tall, leaning on his cane, and looked at his men. "Stand up," he commanded. One by one, the soldiers glanced at Marzio, then at the old lion. The power shift was visible, a physical wave moving across the room. The authority had moved from the man with the money to the woman with the words. Slowly, with confused and hesitant movements, the crew rose. Even Sal, his face flushed with shame, stood straight, his hands visible and empty. "She is a guest of this family," Armo declared, his voice thick with a new strength. "From this moment, she is untouchable. If a hair on her head is harmed, if a word of disrespect is whispered in her direction, you will answer to the old laws. And the old laws do not offer a second chance." Loretta stood at the center of the circle of armed men, her head held high. She was no longer a ghost, she was the axis upon which the Russo family now turned. The air in the restaurant had changed its chemistry. As Loretta stepped back from the table, the mezzanine was no longer a dining room, it was a cathedral of heavy silence. Mr. Henderson stood by the service doors, his face a mask of paralyzed confusion, watching the unthinkable. The city's most feared men standing in a ragged line of forced respect as a waitress walked past them. Loretta did not rush. She moved with the steady, rhythmic gait of the hills, her apron still tied, her head held high. Behind her, she could hear the heavy thud of Armo Padavisi's cane as he followed her toward the exit, his son trailing like a scolded child. Marzio's face was a storm of dark frustration, but he remained silent, his authority overridden by a code he had never bothered to learn. The soldiers, who had treated the bistro like a playground for their brutality just an hour before, now parted like a black sea. When she reached the cloakroom, she didn't wait for Henderson to speak. She didn't need his permission anymore. She untied her apron, folding it neatly on the counter, and picked up her worn wool coat. The garment felt different now, no longer a shroud to hide her, but armor. As she pushed through the heavy brass doors of Loretta, the cool New York night rushed to meet her. The black SUVs were still idling at the curb, their tinted windows reflecting the city's neon glow. Marzio's driver, a man who usually ignored anyone not in a $5,000 suit, stepped forward and opened the door of the lead vehicle. He looked at Loretta, then at Armo, who stood on the sidewalk, the wind catching his silver hair. "A car for the Signorina," Armo commanded, his voice steady and resonant. "Take her wherever she wishes to go. She is to be treated as if I were sitting in that seat myself." Loretta turned to the old lion. For 3 years, she had survived by being nobody, a ghost lost in the vast, indifferent machinery of Manhattan. Now, she was the most visible woman in the city. The secret she had carried. The lineage of the Custodi, the language of the Mountain Kings, was no longer a burden to be hidden. It was a shield that turned the city's monsters into her guardians. "Thank you, Signor Padavisi," she said, her voice clear and unafraid. "No, Loretta," Armo replied, his eyes shining with a gratitude that went deeper than words. "Thank you for reminding me that I am not the last." She stepped into the back of the luxury sedan, the leather soft and smelling of cedar. As the car pulled away from the curb, she looked out the window at the blurred lights of Queens. For the first time since she had arrived in this country, the middle distance was gone. She didn't need to look through people anymore. She could look them in the eye. The ghost was dead, but Loretta M. Avant was finally home.